Hello. We saw in the last lecture that as the euphoria of independence faded, many African nations seemed to veer somewhere between dictatorship on one hand and instability, if not chaos, on the other. And at a certain juncture, world economic conditions turned against them as well. Now, historians are always trying to periodize. We're always trying to divide the unbroken stream of time into eras, epochs, ages, breakpoints, watersheds, turning points, and so on. That's what we do. That's how we argue and find the debates that keep us stimulated. The most obvious breakpoint in recent African history is, of course, the break between colonial and independent Africa, for most of the continent coming, as we've seen, around 1960. And I've argued that that is indeed an important breakpoint. On the other hand, as Frederick Cooper articulates brilliantly in his book, Africa Since 1940, The Past to the Present, a volume which I strongly recommend and have put on the essential reading list for this course, Cooper argues that it's possible to make a persuasive argument for the mid-1970s as an equally, perhaps even more, important dividing line. As Cooper puts it, this is when modest progress turns into prolonged crisis. Now, the modest progress, as we have seen, took place in the late colonial period. There certainly was some, and especially in the early independent years. By almost any measure, health, mortality, literacy, education, overall economic growth and development, political and social participation, ordinary lives got better. And I've argued also that Africa's leaders in that era deserve some credit for this. But it's also true that one context for that was an expansionary world economy, which among other things created demand for exports from Africa's still not fundamentally altered or restructured economies. I think it's fair to say that many, if not most, of the independent African territories remained what I called a few lectures back, essentially mono-economies, dependent upon the export of 1, 2, 3 basic products. Now, both of these situations, that is the modest progress and the hospitable international climate, change dramatically beginning in the mid-1970s. The initial stimulus was external. We can start with the so-called oil shocks, that is the major price rises of that period related, ostensibly at least, to conflict in the Middle East. Those of you who were around in the U.S., for instance, in 1973, 74, 75, can recall the first of these so-called oil shocks. We've certainly seen some since. I need hardly to make the case, I think, that oil, or for the centrality of oil in modern economic life everywhere. So, partly due to these shocks, Western economies began to contract in the mid-1970s. This had the dire consequence for Africa of reducing the demand and the price for many of the primary products, the agricultural and mineral products, coming out of the continent. Meanwhile, some Western nations, notably the U.S., responded to the problems they were encountering by raising interest rates to levels hard to imagine more recently. I was fortunate enough to be able to purchase my first home in the late 1970s, and assistant professors normally are purchasing modest homes, but mine had to be particularly modest because the interest rates, of course, that I had to sign on to in terms of the mortgage were well into the teens. Rather suddenly then, African countries and their leaders confronted conditions in which the value of their exports was falling, on which they were so dependent. The price of, in many instances, their most vital import, oil, was rising, and the cost of funds, borrowed funds, to make up the difference, let alone to invest in future productivity, was rising as well. What we've been discussing at one level is captured in a simple but useful concept, a simple term, and that term is the terms of trade. Essentially, how much can you bring in of a particular commodity in return for what you send out? It is a useful concept, and it doesn't have to necessarily be related only to, for instance, a country's international trade context. I've seen it applied in a place like Zambia, for instance, to terms of trade between the urban and rural sectors. Many African leaders, governments, did things such as subsidize food supplies in the urban areas precisely because their judgment, which has turned out to be correct, is that urban areas are where popular protest and disruption are most likely to be carried out. So terms of trade can be applied in many contexts, but let's bring it back to the notion of how much can you bring in terms of how much you are sending out. Now, if the terms of trade are deteriorating, that is, from your perspective, from where you sit, if you can bring in less and less for what you send out, in a situation like that, and that was the situation for much of Africa, beginning in the mid-70s, even the best leaders would have been presiding over places where, as one of the ones put it, we must run faster and faster to stay in the same place. And as many Africans would point out, would not be hesitant to point out, their leaders were often not the best. So, from about this juncture, most countries began to see a decline in all the realms which had so recently seen improvement in overall GNP, product, economic growth, becomes negative, in industrialization, in education, health, and infrastructure. And understandably, this in turn generated discontent. Those in power, who in very many cases had already moved to one-party states or military rule, as we traced in the last lecture, reacted defensively by clamping down even further and making sure that feathering their nests in this declining situation remained a priority. Or, in some cases, they were replaced by new rulers through a military coup, who then did much the same thing. Now, allow me once again, as I did in the last lecture and will again in the next lecture, to illustrate from the place I think I know best, and that is Zambia. Now, as we've seen, Zambia's principal export, indeed its only real export, was copper. From the time copper is discovered in Zambia in the 1930s along its so-called copper belt, the figure for copper as a percentage of Zambia's, even northern Rhodesia's, during the colonial periods, exports was consistently over 90%, in some cases over 95%. As Kenneth Kaunda, the country's first president, put it, and again, someone whom I described some in the last lecture, we were born with a copper spoon in our mouth. It's a rather striking way to say that we had some things going for us. We had some blessings at independence, and he was referring to this long-run boom, if you like. I mean, there were certainly slumps in it, but essentially consistently expansionary world demand for the one thing that Zambia had in abundance, and that, of course, was copper. Now, Demand from the outside world for copper, though, begins to fall almost exactly at Cooper's critical juncture of the mid-1970s. And it has never quite recovered. I don't mean to say that it's disappeared, obviously, but it's never gotten back to the buoyant phases that we saw in the late 40s, in the 50s, in much of the 60s. And there are numerous reasons for this, but even a moment's reflection, I think, would tell us one. If you think of telecommunications, quite apart from the whole wireless revolution that we're all witnessing, of course, even if we think of the wired kinds of communications, quite some time ago, metals, including copper, began to be replaced in wires in this critical industry with things like fiber optics and so on. Okay. Now, Zambia produces no oil. It doesn't produce any petroleum whatsoever. Not one drop comes out of this landlocked country. Yet, of course, oil is absolutely critical, as it is everywhere, for the matters of transportation and applications of energy to all kinds of projects, including running the machinery to operate the copper mines. With a fall then in the crucial export commodity and a rise in the crucial imported commodity, Zambia needed to produce much more copper just to stay even. It produced somewhat more copper, but it certainly did not stay even. We start a downward slide from which, in a number of respects, the country has yet to escape. Now, just to add a few more straws to the camel's back in the case of Zambia, during the 1970s, the country is surrounded on three sides by war. In Angola to the west, Mozambique to the east. We looked at those so-called late decolonization cases a couple of lectures back. And of course, its old partner in the Federation days, Rhodesia. The wars produced direct strains on Zambia in the 70s, quite apart from the kinds of terms of trade troubles that I've been outlining. Tens of thousands of refugees from these wars, flowing into western Zambia from Angola, flowing into eastern Zambia from Mozambique, and so on. From Rhodesia, there were certainly refugees, but it went a bit further in that case. President Kaunda, Zambian President Kaunda's personal commitment, and it was a personal commitment, and he paid for it, a personal commitment to the liberation of southern Africa, if you like, led him to allow bases in Zambia, initially for both guerrilla movements in Zimbabwe, but eventually for one. He allowed bases for the ZAPU movement, Zimbabwe African People's Union, in various places in Zambia. Now, of course, Rhodesia was directly next door, and many places in Zambia were very quickly reached by the aircraft controlled by Ian Smith's Rhodesian Air Force. In my visit to Zambia in 1979, just as the Zimbabwean War was coming finally to a close, but it certainly was not there yet, this came home to me very vividly. There were 2 or 3 occasions in the capital when I walk out of the archives and someone would say, well, look that way, look to the west, and you could see the smoke rising from fighter-bomber attacks, essentially, launched from Rhodesia and hitting ZAPU bases, which everybody knew were located some miles to the west of the capital. Indeed, Joshua Nkomo, the leader of ZAPU, at that time, his headquarters was in a house in a residential area in the capital of Zambia, Lusaka, and I remember being taken by friends of mine in a car around to to see this house after it had been attacked in a lightning helicopter raid of Smith's forces across the border and right into a sort of daylight boldness into the center of Lusaka, and the attack on that house had left it a burnt-out shell. They actually drove, and you could see barely literally the bathroom window on the back. In this case, he came out through the bathroom window. Given that Nkomo is a very large man, he's no longer with us, a very large man indeed, that's how he escaped. It might have been a quite comic scene had it not been so deadly serious. I can remember being in Livingston, which is near Victoria Falls, and therefore, of course, right near the border with Rhodesia at that point, and going to the local office of the Ministry of Education and using their phones, finally making telephone contact with a rural school about 20 miles outside of Livingston, where an old friend of mine from my earlier dissertation research days was a teacher and assistant principal, and finally getting him on the line and saying, well, gee, I'm ready to come and visit you, and I'll hire a taxi here in town, and having Nelson Semenego, my friend, saying, no, don't come, forget that, and I will come in to see you. I'll explain why. And when he got there, the reason was that school was right next door to a ZAPU base. And had I rolled into that particular region and rolled past some of those ZAPU guerrilla soldiers, they of course might have mistaken me for an agent of Mr. Smith, and you can guess the possible outcome at that point. Now, these wars also had indirect consequences for Zambia. Zambia, after all, is a landlocked country, and the movement of exports, its copper, the imports, the oil, for instance, has always been lengthy and expensive. With the wars on these various sides, 2 of the 3 principal routes out of Zambia were in fact closed, the one through Angola and the one through Rhodesia, and from there on out to Mozambique. So this left one of the very few exceptions to the rule we enunciated a few lectures back, that most of railway lines in Africa were built during the colonial period. One great exception to that was the Tanzam Railroad, which connects Tanzania and Zambia, and that became the only way to get what copper Zambia could produce out. Okay, but it's a much longer, more expensive route, and again, this adds to the overall declining viability of the industry on which Zambia was most dependent. Now, Zambia was never a place where people disappeared in the night, where the bodies were found as a result of governments kidnapping and murdering them, and so it was never like that. Still, it's true to say, and it's fair to say, that Kaunda's rule became steadily more authoritarian. It's true also that the dead hand in this case of state mismanagement, I'll say it that. We know the central role of the state, and whatever successes it had earlier, it became increasingly unresponsive to the citizenry's needs, and frankly, less and less efficient. You could see some very real manifestations of this by the 1970s and into the 80s. The lines for commodities, when things were not being distributed on basically market models and so on, you'd see people who got the word, well, they're going to bring in cooking oil tomorrow. Let's send a child down there and get in the queue, get in the line. And often these lines would stretch for many blocks, waiting to get an essential or a basic commodity. People would send different family members to take each other's places in the lines. You can imagine that tempers flare in a situation like this. This is starting to take on a social and a cultural series of manifestations. Sometimes the mismanagements and downturn here took on an almost comical kind of appearance. I was raised in Northern Virginia and have spent a lot of time in the mountains of Virginia and West Virginia, and I've seen on occasions that young good old boys and good old girls who want to have a party on a Friday or Saturday night will find somebody's field and bring around the cars, or in many cases the pickup trucks, and assemble them sort of in a circle, and people shine their headlights into the middle, and it makes for a nice little spectacle, a good place to have a party. Now, I mention that because in 1989, as this crisis goes on and on, 1989, I was in Zambia and I wanted to attend a commemoration of the 50th anniversary of what is the Institute for Social and Economic Research. It started life in 1939 as the Rhodes Livingston Institute, and it's one of the great research institutions anywhere in Africa. And I was an affiliate of it when I still am an affiliate of it. And I wanted to be there to be part of the celebration. It was to be held at the Institute's own headquarters. Now, the reason I mention the headlights and so on is because by this time, Zambia's electricity supply was hopelessly erratic. And in a place like the capital city, you know, you'd have it on for a few hours, it would go out. You'd have it on a few hours, it'd go out, and so on. It might be a few hours, it might be a few days, but it was extremely undependable. Well, all of these dignitaries, some of the great anthropologists and social scientists of the world, well beyond my station in life, are assembled for an evening ceremony there. Well, there's no power. And incredibly, what happened was that they brought a number of government Land Rovers around, assembled them in the old West Virginia style circle, and that's how we carried out the ceremony. I remember at a time that in the 1980s, there were no matches to be found in the country. Now, when you're in a country where a lot of people still cook over fires, you know, matches are pretty important. And they'd bring on the manager of the state-run match factory, and he'd say, well, we put, 500 cases out there. I don't know where. You're getting black marketeering, of course, that's going on, and extortion that way from these heavy hand of state mismanagement. Again, at the same time that you couldn't get any matches, for instance, though, you could go down the road to the local service station and you could find hundreds of Zippo lighters. Now, how does that happen? You can imagine if I'm asking that question, what kinds of questions Zambians are asking. Meanwhile, they see that those, at least at the very top, are continuing to get rich. All of this exacerbated public anger. It inspired attempted coups eventually against Kenneth Kaunda. Now, what do? Many countries, Zambia included, began to borrow furiously, despite the rise in interest rates, which eventually did fall again, of course, began to borrow furiously in attempts to keep going what they could of the economy and of the social services which they had built up in the first period after independence. They were encouraged to do so in some lending sectors from the first world. These were bad business decisions all around, and debt rose exponentially. As the ability to make payments on those debts faltered, many African countries turned to lenders of the last resort, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. What help they got came with considerable strings, and these are usually referred to as structural adjustment programs, which called for a reversal of the large state role in these economies and a turn to market solutions, so-called, including lowering tariffs, most importantly, perhaps, reducing government budgets, including expenditure on social services, devaluing currency to make exports more competitive, and so on. The supporters of structural adjustment programs essentially argue that these are prescriptions of short-term belt tightening in order to make long-term growth possible. The critics of the IMF, the World Bank, call it long-term belt tightening in order to facilitate debt repayment. Now, the jury is still out on SAPs, the structural adjustment programs, in terms of macro-level improvement. There's no doubt that some reforms were certainly necessary, and the dead hand of state mismanagement in Zambia was a good example of that. On the other hand, there's little doubt that for ordinary people, life got harder. In terms of declining standards of healthcare and education, or rising costs, to put it differently, as these are privatized and subjected to market solutions. Of course, the debt crisis in Africa is very much still with us and has recently been the target of campaigns for reduction or restructuring or forgiveness. A movement organization called Jubilee 2000, which included Archbishop Tutu from South Africa, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and so on, which took its model from passages in the Old Testament where every 40 or 50 years or what have you, there was a jubilee and people were forgiven and debts were forgiven and so forth. In the summer of 2005, a number of great rock stars and actors and so forth participate in a series of concerts called Live 8, and the 8 there, of course, was a reference to the 8 richest countries on earth whose leaders were meeting at the time that these concerts went forth and made the case. They were trying to get the ear of those governments to restructure, reduce, or forgive debts from the world's poorest countries, most of which are in Africa. The argument for debt restructuring and forgiveness is essentially that today's population had nothing to do with the bad decisions that were made a generation or two ago, often by leaders that aren't there anymore, and that therefore they shouldn't be saddled with it. In other words, if it had been an individual who took on all this credit card debt or what have you unwisely, the person might be able to declare bankruptcy and get a fresh start. But that option is not available for countries who continue to bear these burdens. Okay. Now, maybe at some point in listening or watching this, you said to yourself, now wait a minute, aren't there some oil-producing countries in Africa? And on the face of it, shouldn't they have been in a very different boat from the cases like Zambia that I was just discussing? And of course, there's a lot to that. A country like Nigeria, a member of OPEC, for instance, certainly in theory, I would say in reality, should very definitely have benefited from the so-called oil shocks, which did indeed shock many countries lying elsewhere in the continent. And yet Nigeria, Angola, Gabon, what Cooper calls, they amounted to what Cooper calls spigot economies. The oil was turned on, as it was. The oil is produced by foreign companies, often by foreign technicians for foreign consumers, and that there was very little linkage to the rest of the economy. In a place like Angola, you get some very bizarre scenes in the 1970s and 80s. Remember that Angola has this ongoing civil war, and you have companies like Gulf producing oil just offshore, and the Marxist government of Angola using its own and Cuban troops to protect the oil production against opponents in Angola's civil war supported by the U.S. government. Talk about strange bedfellows there. But again, extremely little linkage, and what revenue that the Angolan government got out of oil production often went into the costs of fighting the war. Now, what linkage there was, what revenue did accumulate from oil production in a place like Nigeria, and it was an enormous amount of money in terms of raw figures, often it was wasted by astounding levels of mismanagement and corruption. This prompted our old friend, Chinua Achebe, to write a book that was not a novel. And that was a nonfiction essay, essentially, called The Trouble with Nigeria, his home country, of course. And Achebe, in the first couple of pages of that book says, I don't want to hear it. There's nothing wrong with Nigeria's climate, nothing wrong with our culture, nothing wrong with our people, etc. We've been given this great blessing of this oil beneath the surface, and look what's happening to it and how the rest of us are getting nothing out of it. He pointed his finger right at the authorities and said, the trouble with Nigeria, his term, simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Now, if all this were not enough, we can add more wars. We mentioned Angola, Rhodesia, Mozambique, but Unfortunately, you could add Sierra Leone, Liberia, Somalia, Sudan, and people in those places suffered the worst of the worst. You could finally add South Africa, mired in the 1980s in a low-level war of its own. It's not surprising that many people could ask, can things get any worse at this point? Then a funny thing happened. Phoenix-like, something like a democratic renaissance began to gather steam, and we turn to that in our next lecture. Thank you.